The Yi 4K Plus. Does this thing hold its own in comparison to the competition? So I received this camera a few months ago and you guys have seen me use it in a few of my videos, but I wanted to give a more proper review of it. I want you guys to be aware of its plus sides and its downsides so you can decide for yourself whether it's really worth buying this camera or not. Now this review is totally based on my mountain biking experience, since that's basically the only way that I've used this camera. So first of all, the Yi 4K Plus is made very similar to how GoPro is made. Now that makes it very easily understandable for someone like me who has only ever used GoPro action cameras before. In terms of its physical build, it looks very much the same, especially compared to the Hero 5 or 6, where the SD card is put in right beside the battery just like the Hero 5 or 6. It's very similar in size to the Hero 4, so you can use it with all those gimbals no problem. And then even when it comes to all the settings, they're pretty much identical to what you find on GoPro, with a couple extra little ones. So the 4K Plus can record 4K up to 60 frames. They also have the Super View mode equivalent, which is called Ultra. Now I was first pleased to find out that when you use your 4K 60 frames, it doesn't actually change the dynamic range on this camera like it does on the Hero 6. But then I was soon disappointed to find out that the dynamic range is quite a bit worse anyway than on the Hero 6. So the dynamic range on the Yi 4K Plus is noticeably worse, and this is a pretty big deal for me. So this is without any settings adjusted, just straight out of the box, and the Hero 6 is already noticeably better than the 4K Plus. And then when you add flat mode to the Hero 6 and to the 4K Plus, it does brighten things on the GoPro and it darkens everything on the 4K Plus. And then when you adjust the exposure comp to make the exposures a bit more proper, negative 0.5 on Hero 6, positive 0.5 on the 4K Plus, the exposures aren't quite the same, but still the dynamic range is just way more on the Hero 6, and the dynamic range is still just as bad, it seems, on the 4K Plus. You can also see here how slow the 4K Plus is to adjust its exposure in some of these shots. I also just wanted to stop here for 1 second and take note of that difference in motion blur on these cameras, and that's because of a different shutter speed. So clearly the Yi 4K Plus has a slower shutter speed here, but I don't really understand why it would have a slower shutter speed since the exposures generally seem about the same. You can certainly see the lesser dynamic range in the 4K Plus, but they're both on automatic settings. They're both at 4K 30 frames per second, automatic shutter speed. And so it's quite interesting that the 4K Plus is at a slower shutter speed. I know that both cameras have a fixed f-stop at f2.8, but for some reason the 4K Plus seemed to need to go to a slower shutter speed. I wonder if it has something to do with the flat mode and then using positive 0.5 exposure comp. The flat mode on the 4K Plus does seem to affect the colors more than it does the dynamic range, which I guess sort of makes sense, but just compared to how the Hero 6 works, the Hero 6 mostly just gives you more dynamic range, and the flat mode on the 4K Plus just kind of darkens everything while also muting the colors a bunch. So I'd actually avoid the flat mode altogether and just keep EVID comp at 0. So here's just another good example of the differences in dynamic range. You can see the 4K Plus, the snow is just blown out and the shadows are really quite dark, while the Hero 6 handles everything quite well. Now on the Hero 6 I'm using flat mode with negative 0.5, which is a pretty normal settings that I use, and the 4K Plus I was also using flat mode with I think 0 exposure comp. It just shows the dynamic range is still quite different. There you go. Since I'm always using the 4K 30 frame per second Super View mode on the Hero 6, I did the same settings with the 4K Plus as I used it for riding. Now one thing you can notice pretty quickly is the exposures are different and they adjust a lot slower on the 4K Plus, and that's kind of a big issue for me, especially compared to the super quick adjustments that the Hero 6 makes. Combine that with the lower dynamic range and there's a lot of times when the exposure just doesn't look that great. Oh frick! But then again, that's mostly in these dark, shadowy, treed-in areas.
Maybe that wasn't so good.
Even when going out into the open, I was surprised at how weird the exposures were. They're just really bright. It may have had to do with my exposure setting being on center or spot, which I realized probably wasn't the best option.
Alright.
I did not have these kinds of problems when it was more cloudy and more evenly lit.
Yeah, just, whoa, what? Oh, sick. Sick. Woo!
There are a few different options in how the 4K Plus exposes. There's center, spot, and average, and I think average is actually probably the better one. And like I said, I don't even bother with flat mode anymore on this camera. The audio does seem to be better on the 4K Plus, just obviously make sure it's out of its housing, but with such terrible audio on the Hero 5 and 6, I mean, I don't even know if that's saying much. I had both cameras set to low sharpness, but the E4K Plus does seem to have a higher sharpness actually than the Hero 6. I thought that was just a bit interesting. The build construction is not quite as good as you might expect. This one clip can easily be stuck in the open position, meaning you can open it up easily. It never ended up actually being a problem, but you could just notice some little things like that are just not quite up to the same quality as what GoPro build might be. One cool thing about the 4K Plus is you can have access to higher bit rates. You can even choose your quality, high, medium, and low, and I think that's really cool. The highest bit rate it goes up to is 135 megabits for 4K 60 frames, or the highest it goes at 4K 30 frames is 100 megabits per second, which is certainly better than what GoPro does, except I still find the Hero 6 footage to be a little bit nicer looking, honestly.
Whew. Yeah, this is totally new to me, so this is pretty cool. Alright. It's looking pretty fresh looking as well.
One disadvantage of the 4K Plus is there are less resolution and frame rate options. Even though both these cameras can do 4K 60 frames, the 4K Plus can only go up to 60 frames at 2.7K and 120 frames at 1080, and then 240 frames at 720, where the Hero 6 can double those frame rates with those same resolutions. Now there's one pretty cool feature that this camera has, and that is that you can adjust the distorted lens look. By turning it on and off, it really kind of eliminates that really warped look. I believe it's similar to what the linear option is in the GoPros, except on the 4K Plus you have this option all the way up to 4K 30 frames a second, while on the GoPro you can only do it up to 2.7K. Overall, this camera is cheaper than the Hero 6, and for some of you it may definitely be worth it. For me personally, I'd actually just rather spend the extra money for the Hero 6. What do you guys think? Do you think this camera is worth the lower price tag? Or would you rather spend extra for something even better? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. I want to give a special thanks to my Boostmaster patrons. If you love downhill and free ride, or just love riding mountain bikes, then consider subscribing. And if you like to see more content and keep me rolling on two wheels, then check out my Patreon page.